Before the front window of the bakery shattered, before the men in dark coats stepped through the broken glass with their boots crunching on sugar and flour, before the screaming started at the back tables, and the espresso machine kept hissing into the silence as if nothing in the world had changed, a young woman behind the counter was wiping down a tray of unsold rolls and humming something so quietly that only the bread could hear it. Then the door exploded inward. "Everyone down, hands flat, don't move." The voice belonged to a man in a charcoal coat at the threshold, a man whose name was whispered across 4 neighborhoods and never written in any newspaper. Behind him, 3 more men spread into the room. Customers dropped. A briefcase hit the floor. A woman in a green scarf began to weep without sound, but the girl behind the counter did not get down. She set the dish towel aside. She placed her hands gently on the rim of the pastry case. She looked across the room, past the rifles, past the shattered glass, directly into the eyes of the man at the door, and she said, in a voice barely louder than the steam of the espresso machine, "He isn't here, but I know who you're looking for, and I know what he did to you." The room went silent. The man in the charcoal coat did not lower his weapon. He did not raise it either. He simply stood there while every other man in his crew turned their heads toward him, because none of them had ever seen him hesitate at anything. Men like him did not freeze in the doorway of a bakery on a Tuesday afternoon because a girl in a flour-dusted apron had spoken 7 sentences too many. But he had heard something in her voice, something he had not heard in a very long time. And even Bram Wojciech, who had buried more men than he could remember the names of, could not move. The bakery sat on the corner of Meerton Lane and 5th, in a part of the city that had once belonged to immigrant grandmothers and Sunday morning church crowds, and was now the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights flickered after 9 and the rent kept rising on storefronts that nobody wanted anymore. The shop was simply called Halcom's, after the man who had built it 60 years earlier and whose grandchildren had long since sold it off. The current owner, a thin Polish man with a weak heart, came in 3 mornings a week to count the till and complain about the price of butter, and he left the rest of it to the girl. It was October. The kind of October that couldn't decide whether to commit to winter, where the mornings smelled like wet leaves and the afternoons still carried a stubborn warmth that made people leave their coats unbuttoned. The bakery's front window faced east, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the light came through it at a low, slanting angle that turned the wood-paneled walls a soft amber and made the rows of bread on the back shelf look like something out of a painting nobody had bothered to hang in a museum. There were 6 small tables inside, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu written in the same handwriting for years, a bell above the door that rang too softly to be useful, a radio behind the counter that played classical music at a volume so low that customers often asked if it was on at all. It was the kind of place that didn't make money. It was the kind of place that survived, because the people who came in had nowhere else to go. The retired postman who sat by the window every afternoon with a paperback. The 2 old women who shared 1 slice of almond cake. The night shift nurse from the hospital across the avenue who came in at 6 in the morning, ordered coffee, and stared at nothing for 20 minutes before walking back out into the world. The bakery had a quality of holding its breath, as if the building itself knew it existed in a slow, shrinking pocket of the city where the rules of the outer world did not yet apply, and it intended to protect that pocket for as long as it could. The girl behind the counter understood this. She had been working there for 9 months, ever since the morning she had walked in with a wet coat and no references, and asked the thin Polish man if he needed help. He had looked at her once. He had not asked her name twice. He had handed her an apron and said, "Bread comes out of the oven at 5. Don't burn it." That had been the entire interview. She had not burned it. Not once. Outside, the leaves were starting to fall in slow drifting clusters, and a black sedan had been parked across the street for the last 40 minutes with its engine idling. Nobody inside the bakery had noticed it. Nobody, that is, except the girl behind the counter. who had glanced at it twice while wiping down the tray of rolls and had thought, very quietly, very briefly, and without telling anyone, "They've come for someone, and they don't know I'm here." Her name was Sable Coravin, and she was 26 years old, though most days she felt closer to 40, and some days she felt closer to 12. She had black hair braided down her back in a single thick rope, and the kind of eyes people often described as gray, but were really the color of river stones after rain, flecked with something darker at the center, watchful in a way that strangers usually noticed and then forgot. She was thin from years of eating only what fit in her hand and only when there was time. Her wrists were narrow, her hands were calloused along the sides where bread dough had rubbed them raw and healed them rougher. There was a small white scar above her left eyebrow that she touched, sometimes, without realizing she was doing it, when a sound startled her. A car backfiring, a door slamming too hard, a man's laugh from the wrong side of the room. But Sable Coravin had a habit nobody who watched her could quite explain. She hummed, not loudly, not even continuously, but all day long in small private bursts, while she shaped the dough, while she swept the floor, while she counted change for the retired postman. She hummed fragments of songs that no one in the bakery recognized. Old songs, slow ones, lullabies in a language that wasn't English, and folk tunes from somewhere east of every map most Americans had ever bothered to study. The two old women had once asked her where the songs came from, and Sable had smiled and said, "My grandmother," and that had been the end of it. The truth was that the songs were the only thing Sable had left of a childhood that had ended on a winter night when she was 12, when men had come to her family's house with documents her father could not read and contracts her mother had not signed, and by morning everything she had ever called her own was gone. The truth was that Sable Coravin had not always been Sable Coravin. She had been someone else once, a girl with a different last name and a different life, and she had survived being passed from one set of hands to another, from one city to another, from one set of false papers to another, by learning two things very early: how to disappear inside a room and how to listen. And what she had heard, in the months before she walked into Halcom's bakery, was the name of the man who had ruined her family. The name had been spoken in a back room of a restaurant where she had worked as a dishwasher for 6 weeks before she'd had to disappear again. It had been spoken by a man in a leather jacket on a phone call he hadn't realized she could hear. He had said 2 names. The first belonged to the man who had ordered the night her family ended. The second belonged to one of the men who had carried it out. The man who had stood in her parents' doorway with a folder of documents. His name was Peter, and apparently he had been hiding in this city for months, and the first man wanted him found. That first name, the one her grandmother had whispered in a hospital bed when Sable was 14. "Be patient," her grandmother had said. "The world is small. It brings everything back to itself eventually." That was what Sable had spent the last 9 months doing in the bakery. Waiting. She had not known what she was waiting for. She had only known that men who hurt people for a living tended to hurt each other eventually, and that if she stood very still in one place for long enough, something would come for one of them. She had not expected it to come this way. She had not expected the man in the charcoal coat to walk through the front door on a Tuesday afternoon with 3 of his men behind him and the look of someone who had been hunting Peter for reasons of his own. She had not expected, when he said "get down," to find herself standing perfectly still behind the pastry case with her hands flat on the glass. But she had recognized something in him, the accent of his crew when they spoke to each other in low voices on the sidewalk, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved through a room. He was from her part of the world. He was hunting Peter. And there were only so many men who would hunt Peter, and only so many reasons to hunt him. The man at the door had a wound that matched her own. She did not know it for certain. She suspected it. And 9 months of waiting had taught her that suspecting was sometimes enough. She opened her mouth, and she said the only 7 sentences she had been carrying for 14 years, waiting to give to the right person. The village was called Bravari, and it sat in a fold of land between 2 rivers in a country that had changed its name 3 times in Sable's grandmother's lifetime. 46 houses, 1 church with a green roof, a school with 2 classrooms. Sable's father was a forester. He kept records of the trees, marked the ones that were dying, planted the ones that would replace them in 100 years. Her mother taught the younger children at the school and grew tomatoes along the south wall of their house and could play 3 different folk instruments without ever having taken a lesson in her life. There was a cat named Tisha who slept on the wood stove. There was a goat named Petrick who hated everyone except Sable's grandmother. There was a quilt on her bed that her great-aunt had stitched the year Sable was born, and every square had a different bird on it. She was the kind of child who collected things: smooth stones from the river, feathers from the chickens, pine cones, but only the small ones. She kept them in a wooden box under her bed, and every Sunday afternoon she took them out and laid them on the floor in long, careful rows and named each one. She was building a museum, she told her grandmother. A museum of the world. She was 12 years old when the world she was building came apart. It happened in February, on a night so cold the windows had grown a layer of frost so thick that the candlelight from inside the house cast no shadows on the snow. There had been rumors for months. A man in the city, a man with foreign money and foreign lawyers, had been buying land. Quietly at first, then less quietly, then with contracts written in a dialect of legal language the priest said God himself would have struggled to interpret. The man's name was something nobody in the village would say out loud, because saying it was understood to be the same as inviting it across your threshold. He owned mines and shipping routes and 3 small newspapers. He had been trying for 2 years to buy the forest that Sable's father managed, because it sat above a vein of something valuable that her father had refused, on 3 separate occasions, to allow anyone to dig for. On the night of February the 11th, 4 men came to the house. They were polite at first. They sat at the kitchen table. They drank the tea that Sable's mother poured for them. They placed a folder of documents on the table and explained, in calm voices, that her father was going to sign, and that if he did not, things would happen that nobody in the room would be able to undo. Sable was hiding behind the wood stove. Her father did not sign. What happened next took less than an hour. Sable would not remember most of it later, only in fragments that surfaced for the rest of her life at unpredictable times. The sound of a chair falling. Her mother's voice saying a word Sable had never heard her say. The smell of kerosene. The cat Tisha running past the wood stove with her fur on end and her tail straight up like a chimney. The light of the fire on the snow outside. Orange and white and orange and white, like the world had been turned inside out. She survived because her grandmother found her behind the wood stove and pulled her out through the root cellar, and because her grandmother had the presence of mind in the worst hour of her life, to wrap Sable in a wool blanket and walk her 3 kilometers through the snow to a neighbor's house without speaking a single word the entire way. Her parents did not survive. The house did not survive. The forest was sold within 6 months to a company nobody could trace. Sable was sent to live with a cousin of her grandmother's in a city to the west. Her grandmother went into a hospital that winter and never came out. When that cousin could no longer afford to keep her, Sable was sent to another, and then to a woman who claimed to be a cousin but was not, and by the time she was 15 she had crossed 2 borders and was sleeping in the closet of a hotel kitchen and carrying false papers. In all the years that followed, the name of the man who had sent the 4 men had been spoken to her exactly twice. Once by her grandmother, on the last night of her grandmother's life, when Sable was 14. "Be patient," her grandmother had whispered. "The world is small. It brings everything back to itself eventually." The second time had been 9 months ago, in the back room of that restaurant, on the phone call she had not been meant to hear. That night, when she finished her shift, she had walked out of the back kitchen and she had not gone back. She had taken the $73 she had saved. She had taken the photograph of her parents folded into the lining of her coat. She had walked for 2 days, and on the third morning she had walked into a bakery on the corner of Merton Lane and Fifth, and the thin Polish man had handed her an apron and told her not to burn the bread. And now, 14 years and 1 ocean and 4 false names later, the man in the charcoal coat had walked through the door of that bakery hunting Peter, the second name. And Peter had been sent, 14 years ago, by the first name. The name her grandmother had whispered. 2 men can hate the same enemy without ever having met. But sometimes, the world brings them into the same room. Bram Wojciech had not moved. He was 48 years old, and he had been standing in the doorway for exactly 9 seconds, though the 9 seconds had begun to feel longer to the men behind him, because Bram Wojciech did not stand still in doorways. He did not stare at strangers behind pastry cases. He did not lower the muzzle of his weapon by half an inch, when a young woman who was supposed to be face down on the floor had instead delivered 7 sentences in a voice barely louder than the espresso machine. But he was not lowering it. He was not raising it either. He was standing perfectly still, the way a man stands when something he buried a long time ago has somehow climbed up out of the ground and is now looking him in the eye from across a room full of broken glass and frightened customers. His 3 men did not understand what was happening. The eldest had worked for Bram for 11 years, and he had only ever seen this expression on his boss's face once before. On a winter night long ago, at the edge of an open grave that Bram had not been able to throw the first handful of dirt into. The eldest had thrown it for him that night, and had never asked any questions afterward. Some men carried things forever, and the most you could do for them was throw the first handful of dirt when they could not. The girl behind the pastry case had not blinked. She was waiting. Sable Korovin had calculated this carefully in the half-second before she opened her mouth. She had known there were 3 possibilities for how the next minute would go. The first was that she got down with everyone else, and the men did what they had come to do, and she lived. The second was that something went wrong, the way things sometimes did in rooms like this, and she did not live. The third was the one she had been waiting 9 months to find out whether she had the courage to choose. She had not chosen it because she was brave. She had chosen it because she was tired. The kind of tired that lives in the bones. The kind that makes a young woman of 26 wipe down a tray of unsold rolls at the end of a Tuesday afternoon and think very clearly, I cannot do this for 1 more month. She had said the third sentence on purpose. It was the only one that would tell him she was not guessing. Guessing would have killed her. Knowing might not. She watched his face. She watched the way his jaw tightened, the way the muscle in his cheek moved once and stopped. She watched his eyes, which were a dark brown that was almost black, and she watched the way those eyes were trying very hard not to show her what they were showing her. What they were showing her was the eyes of a boy. Not a 48-year-old man with 3 armed men behind him. A boy of about 22, standing somewhere very far away from this bakery, watching something he could not stop. And Sable, who had been 12 years old behind a wood stove on a February night, recognized that boy. Because she had been that boy. Bram lowered his weapon. Not all the way. Just enough that the muzzle was no longer pointed at the pastry case. Just enough that the 3 men behind him saw the gesture and slowly lowered theirs as well. The bakery was very quiet. The espresso machine hissed. The retired postman by the window had not moved from his chair, because he was 81 years old and his knees did not bend the way they once had, and he had decided sometime in the last 40 seconds that if this was how he was going to die, he was going to die sitting up. He was watching the 2 of them now with an expression of mild scholarly interest, as if this were a documentary he had not expected to find on the channel he had been planning to watch. Bram took 1 step into the bakery, then a second. Then he stopped, because he had realized, with the kind of clarity that arrives only in the worst moments of a person's life, that he did not know what to say. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was lower than it had been at the door. The command was gone from it. What was left was curiosity, and underneath the curiosity, something that sounded almost like fear. She did not answer directly. "I think you should send your men outside," she said. "I think you and I should sit at one of these tables. There is something we need to discuss, and I do not think we should discuss it in front of an audience." Bram looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his eldest and said very quietly, "Take the others. Wait in the car." The eldest hesitated. He had 11 years' worth of questions, and not one was a question he was going to ask. He nodded once, gestured to the others, and the three of them walked back out through the broken doorway. The bell above the door rang softly as it closed behind them. The bakery was left with the espresso machine, and the radio, and the retired postman, who had quietly decided that he was not going to leave his chair until he found out what was about to happen next. He sat down across from her at the small table nearest the counter. He moved like a man twice his weight. Not because he was heavy. He wasn't. But because every motion he made carried the residue of every motion that had come before it. He set the weapon on the table, muzzle down, away from her, with a care that was almost ceremonial. "Tell me what you know," he said. Sable did not speak right away. She was studying him the way she studied bread when it came out of the oven, looking for the small signs that told her whether what was inside was finished. What she saw was a man who had not slept properly in a long time. There were lines around his eyes that did not belong to 48. There was a small tremor in the index finger of his right hand, so faint that nobody who had not been watching for it would have seen it, that he kept resting against his thumb to still. And there was something around his mouth. A tightness, a held thing, that Sable recognized because she saw it in her own face every morning. It was the face of a person who had not allowed themselves to grieve in public. Not once. Not ever. "Your name," she said. "Wojciech. It's a name from my part of the world." "Yes." "Your family was from there." "My mother was. My father was from a village 200 kilometers away. They met in a city neither of them belonged to." "What was your mother's name?" He did not answer for a long moment. And then, in the voice of a man who had not spoken the name out loud in many years, "Vesna." Sable nodded once, slowly. "And your father?" "Anton." "And what happened to them?" The tremor in his finger stopped. His hand became very still. The stillness was worse than the tremor. "You first," he said. So Sable told him. She told him about Bravari, about her father, the forester, and her mother, who taught the younger children, and her grandmother, who walked her 3 kilometers through the snow without speaking. She told him about the 4 men who came on the night of February the 11th, and the documents, and the kerosene, and the cat named Tisha, who she had never seen again after that night, and had thought about, irrationally, for the rest of her life, because somehow the cat's fate was the part she could not stop returning to. She told him the name. The first name. The one her grandmother had whispered to her in the hospital bed. When she said the name, Bram closed his eyes. He did not open them for almost a full minute. When he opened them, what was in them was not anger. Not the cold, focused anger of a man who had spent half his life preparing to do something about a name. What was in them was something Sable did not have a word for. A thing that lived somewhere between exhaustion and recognition. "He killed my mother and my father," Bram said, "when I was 22. "How?" "In a different way than yours, but the same." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The two of them sat across from each other for a long time. The radio behind the counter played something slow and stringed. Then Bram said the thing he had not said to anyone in a very long time. "My mother used to hum, in the kitchen, when she made bread, songs from the village she grew up in. After she died, I stopped being able to hear those songs. I would try to remember them, and I would get 1 or 2 notes, and the rest would be gone." He looked at her. "When I walked through that door," he said, "I heard you humming." Sable did not speak. She could not, because she understood, with the clarity that arrives only when two pieces of a puzzle that have been separated for a long time finally find each other, why he had not been able to move when she had spoken her 7 sentences. He had been frozen by what had come before them, by a sound from a kitchen long ago, carried across an ocean and through a broken door and into the chest of a man who had been very careful, for a very long time, not to feel anything that could hurt him. "What was your mother's song?" Sable asked very quietly. "Do you remember any of it?" Bram looked at the surface of the table. He hummed, very softly, 2 notes. He could not remember the third. Sable closed her eyes, and then, in a voice barely louder than the espresso machine, she hummed the rest of the song for him. It took her 37 seconds. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. The retired postman had stopped reading his paperback. He was looking out at the falling leaves with the kind of expression that men of 81 wear when they have just witnessed something they will not be able to explain to anyone who was not in the room with them. Bram's hand was flat on the surface of the table. It was no longer trembling. "I am going to tell you something now," he said, "that I have not told anyone in 26 years, and then I am going to ask you what you want me to do." Sable nodded, and the man whose name was whispered across 4 neighborhoods began, in the slow, careful voice of a person walking into a room he had locked a long time ago, to tell her about the night his mother died. He told her about a kitchen in a city neither of his parents had belonged to, and a wooden table that had 3 uneven legs because his father had built it from the lumber of a barn that had collapsed the winter before Bram was born. He told her about a small chipped cup his mother drank her tea from every evening at the same hour. His father had been a carpenter who had built a cabinet for a man whose name everyone in the city knew, but nobody said out loud. The cabinet had taken 11 months. When his father had delivered it, the man had refused to pay. His father had asked 3 times, politely. On the 3rd asking, the man had laughed. He told her what came after. He told her about hiding in the small space behind the wood stove, the way she had hidden behind hers. His mother had always told him to go there during thunderstorms, because the stove was the warmest place in any house, and the warmest place was the safest place to wait for something bad to pass. He told her that he had been 22 years old, not 12. He told her that he had been old enough to come out from behind the stove. He told her that he had not. He told her that he had spent every day since trying to forgive himself for it. When he finished, the bakery was very quiet. Sable did not say, "I'm sorry." She did not say, "It wasn't your fault." She did not say any of the things people had probably said to him in the early years, before he had stopped letting people close enough to say them. She said, "What's the mother's name in the song?" "The Lullaby." There are some versions where she has a name in the 3rd verse. It took him a moment to understand the question, and then it took him another moment to understand why she had asked it. She had asked because she was giving him his mother back. Not the death, not the night, the lullaby, the kitchen, the hum. "No," he said. "I don't remember." "It's Vesna. In the version my grandmother sang, the mother's name in the 3rd verse is Vesna, the same as your mother's. It was a common name in those villages." Bram put his hand over his face. He did not make a sound. His shoulders did not shake. He simply sat there with one large hand covering his eyes, and he stayed that way for almost a minute. When he lowered his hand, his face was composed. His eyes were not. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Sable thought about it carefully. She had not, in all these years, allowed herself to think about what she would want. To want something now was a strange and unfamiliar muscle to use. "I don't want him dead," she said finally. Bram tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when an answer has surprised him. "I want him to lose everything," she said. I want him to wake up in a bed that is not his, in a country that does not speak his language, with no money and no lawyers and no men who will return his calls. I want him to live for a long time. I want him to live long enough to understand what he did. I want him to be afraid of every door, the way I have been afraid of every door for as long as I can remember. Death is too small. Death is over too quickly. Bram looked at her for a long time. I am asking you something now, and I want you to think before you answer. I am not telling you what will happen. I am asking you what you will allow. Sable felt something move in her chest at the word allow. She had been told. She had been ordered. She had been moved across borders in the backs of trucks and into rooms she had not chosen. Allow was a word that belonged to people with options. Ask, she said. There are things I can do that you cannot. There are things I can do that the police cannot. They will be done in your name, even if your name is never spoken. I will not do them if you tell me not to. She thought about her grandmother's whisper in the hospital bed. She thought about the cat named Tisha, who had run past the wood stove with her tail straight up like a chimney, and who Sable had thought about every day for reasons she had never been able to explain. She thought, I am allowed to want this. I am allowed. Yes, she said. Bram nodded once. He pulled a phone from the inside pocket of his coat. He pressed a single key. When the person on the other end picked up, he did not greet them. He said one sentence. Begin the file on Peter and open the older one. Then he hung up. He picked up the weapon and slid it into the holster at his side. I am going to leave now. I will send someone to this bakery in the morning. Her name is Imani Rusev. She will come at 9. After today, she will become the person you call if anything ever frightens you, for any reason, for the rest of your life. Do you understand? Sable nodded. Bram stood. He looked down at her once more. My mother's chipped cup, he said, the one she drank her tea from. I still have it. It has been in a box for a long time. I have not been able to take it out. I think tomorrow I will take it out. He turned toward the broken doorway. He paused at the threshold. Without looking back, he said, Thank you for the song. And he walked out into the late October light, where the leaves were falling, and the boy he had once been, the boy behind the stove, walked out of the bakery with him for the first time in many years. Imani Rusev arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning. She was exactly as Bram had described her. Brown wool coat, knee-length, wrapped tight against the wind. Leather bag, scuffed at the corners. She was somewhere in her 50s, with hair the color of iron and a face that was neither warm nor cold, but something more useful than either. Attentive, the face of a woman who had spent 30 years listening to people tell her things they had never told anyone else. She did not knock. She tried the door, found it open, and walked in. Sable was alone. The thin Polish owner had come early, looked at the broken window, looked at Sable, and said only, I'll close it for the week. You'll be paid. Then he had walked out without asking a single question. Imani set her bag on the small table near the counter. She took off her coat and folded it once, neatly, across the back of the chair. I take my coffee black. Make me one. Make yourself one. Sit down. We are going to be here for several hours. Sable did as she was asked. It was the first time in many years that doing what someone told her to do felt like something other than survival. It felt like permission. They sat across from each other at the same table where Sable had sat with Bram the day before, and Imani opened her leather bag and took out a yellow legal pad and 3 pens. Before we begin, I want you to know something. I am not the police. I am not a journalist. I am not an immigration officer. I am a lawyer, and I am very good at my job, and the work I am about to do for you will not cost you any money, ever, for any reason. Everything I am going to ask you to tell me will only matter if you trust that I am not going to use any of it against you. I understand, Sable said. Good. Now, Tell me everything." Sable told her everything. She told her the things she had told Bram the day before. She told her the things she had not told Bram, because she had not had time. She told her about every false name she had ever used. She told her about every room she had been moved through. She told her about the borders she had crossed in the backs of trucks. She told her about the $73 and the photograph of her parents and the long walk to the bakery. She told her the name, the first name, the one her grandmother had whispered. Imani wrote everything down. She did not interrupt. She did not flinch when Sable described things that should have made any normal listener flinch. She wrote, and she nodded, and occasionally she asked a small clarifying question, and the morning became the afternoon, and the afternoon became evening. When Sable finally finished, Imani set her pen down. "I want to tell you what is going to happen now. I am not going to ask your permission, because the things I am going to do are things you have already given Mr. Wojciech permission to do. I am only telling you so that you know." She listed them, one by one. First, by tomorrow morning you will have legal status in this country. Permanent. Your file is being prepared by an immigration attorney who owes Mr. Wojciech a favor he has been trying to repay for 9 years. The papers will be issued under your real name, Sable Korovin, of Bravari. The first time that name has been on a legal document in your possession in 14 years. Sable's eyes filled. She did not speak. Second, the man whose name you said. Within 72 hours, every account he holds in this country will be frozen. The shipping company through which he moves the things he moves will be subjected to a federal investigation that has been waiting on paper for 2 years for someone to provide the evidence necessary to open it. Mr. Wojciech has provided that evidence, anonymously, through 3 intermediaries. He will not die. Mr. Wojciech understood your wishes precisely. He will live for a very long time. He will simply do it in a small room with no windows. Sable's hands had begun to shake. Third, Peter is no longer your concern. He left the country last night on his own. He will not be coming back. He does not know you exist. Imani paused. Fourth, there is a small house, 2 hours north of this city, in a town called Wessenden. It belonged to Mr. Wojciech's mother for the last 8 years of her life. He has paid the taxes on it for as long as it has been his to keep. He has not stepped inside it since the morning after she died. The house is yours if you want it. The deed will be in your name. There are no conditions. You will never see Mr. Wojciech again unless you yourself decide to find him. He has asked me to tell you that this is not a debt. This is not a payment. The house is what his mother would have wanted it to become. Sable could not speak. She put her hands over her face, the way Bram had done the day before, and she sat at the table in the bakery, and she cried for the first time in many years. Not the small, careful crying she had allowed herself in the rooms she had passed through, the other kind, the kind that comes from underneath the place where most crying lives, from a deeper layer that most people never reach, because most people are never given a reason to. Imani did not move. She simply sat there and let Sable cry, and when Sable was finally finished, Imani handed her a clean handkerchief from inside the leather bag, and she said, "Take your time. There is no hurry. There has not been a hurry for a long time. You simply did not know it yet." Over the following weeks, the world began to rearrange itself around Sable Korovin in ways she had not believed the world was capable of. Fenwick Adair finished her papers in 11 days. He delivered them himself, in a manila envelope, to the bakery, and he shook her hand, and he said only, "Welcome, Miss Korovin. You are home." Then he left, because he was not a man for ceremony, and because he understood that the moment belonged to her and not to him. The man whose name Sable had whispered woke up on a Wednesday morning in November to discover that his bank in this country no longer answered his calls. He woke up the following Wednesday to discover that his shipping license had been suspended. He woke up the Wednesday after that to discover that 2 of his lawyers had quietly resigned. By the end of the 2nd month, federal agents were sitting outside his house in 3 separate cars. By the end of the 3rd month, he had been arrested. in a hotel in a city where he did not speak the language, on charges that filled 41 pages and that no court in any country would dismiss. He was sentenced to a long imprisonment in a facility designed specifically for men of his profile. He had no view from his window. He had no telephone privileges except for one call per month, and the only number he was allowed to call was the number of a lawyer who, he gradually came to understand, was not actually working for him. He was 63 when he went in. He had 22 years to think about a forester's family in a village called Bravari, and a carpenter's family in a kitchen with a chipped cup, and the long, quiet patience of a world that had brought everything, eventually, back to itself. Sable did not attend the trial. She did not read the news coverage. She had asked Imani, in their second meeting, to handle all of it on her behalf, and to tell her only when it was finished. When Imani told her it was finished, Sable was rolling out dough for the morning's bread. She set the rolling pin down. She nodded once. She picked the rolling pin back up. She finished the dough. That was all. The grief she had carried did not lift in a single moment. Grief did not work that way. Grief was a thing that left in pieces, the way a long winter left in pieces, with false springs and late frosts and afternoons in March, when the sun came through the kitchen window for the first time in months and made the whole room ache with possibility. But the grief began to leave. Sable moved into the small house in Wessenden in early December. The house had a green metal roof, the same color as the church in Bravari, which she had not noticed until she had pulled into the gravel driveway and turned off the engine of the second-hand car she had bought with her first month's wages. 2 bedrooms, a wood-burning stove, a kitchen with a window that faced east, a small wooden table with 3 uneven legs, which Bram's father had built, the year before Bram was born, from the lumber of a collapsed barn. There was a chipped cup on a shelf above the sink. Imani had brought it. She had not explained. She had only set it on the shelf and said, "He wanted you to have this." Sable did not move it. She left it where Imani had placed it. She used it every morning for tea, the way Vesna Wojciech had used it for 41 years before her. The bakery reopened a week after the broken window was replaced. The thin Polish owner came in himself, on a Saturday, and he looked at the new pane of glass, and he looked at Sable, and he said, "Better, thicker, safer." Then he handed her a small brown envelope and said, "Raise, you should have asked me a long time ago." Sable opened the envelope after he left. Inside was an amount of money she had not earned in any single month of her life. There was also, folded behind the bills, a small handwritten note. "Bread comes out at 5. Don't burn it." She did not burn it. She did not burn it the next morning, or the morning after, or any morning that winter, or the spring that followed, or the summer after that. The bakery filled up slowly with new regulars. The retired postman still came every afternoon with his paperback. The 2 old women still shared the slice of almond cake. The night shift nurse from the hospital across the avenue still came at 6 in the morning and ordered coffee and stared at nothing for 20 minutes. And one morning in February, she finally spoke for the first time, and she said, "Your hands always smell like flour. I can smell it on the cup. It's the only thing I can stand smelling at the end of a shift." Sable smiled, and she said, "Then come every morning. I'll save you the first cup." The night shift nurse came every morning. Her name was Adwoa. Eventually, she stopped staring at nothing. The small house in Wessenden became something Sable had not known she was capable of having. A garden, the second spring, with tomatoes along the south wall, the way her mother had grown them. A gray cat that wandered out of the woods one October afternoon and looked up at Sable on the porch with an expression of mild administrative inquiry, and who Sable named Tisha because she had been waiting a long time to call something Tisha. A wooden box on the shelf beside the chipped cup, where Sable kept smooth stones from the river that ran behind the property. She was building a museum. She was building a museum of the world. She did not see Bram Wojciech again for a long time. Imani came once a month, on the first Tuesday, with a folder of small administrative items and a thermos of coffee and an hour of her time. She never mentioned Bram unless Sable asked. Sable did not often ask. There was a thing between them that did not need maintenance, the way certain promises did not need to be re-promised. One afternoon in late September, almost a year after the broken window, Imani arrived with the usual folder and the usual coffee, and she said, "He has asked me to ask you something. He has asked me to tell you that you are not required to answer, and that he will not ask again if you do not wish him to." "What is it?" Sable said. "He would like to know if you would be willing to teach him the rest of the song." Sable was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Tell him to come on a Tuesday," she said. "Tell him the bakery closes early on Tuesdays. Tell him I will make tea." He came on a Tuesday in October, exactly 1 year and 1 week after the afternoon. He had walked into the bakery with 3 men behind him and a weapon in his hand. He came alone. He drove himself, in an older car that he had owned for many years and rarely used. He wore the same charcoal coat. He parked at the curb where the sedan had once idled. He stood on the sidewalk for almost a full minute before he came inside, and when he did not push the door open hard enough to ring the bell. He pushed it gently, the way a man enters a room where someone is sleeping. Sable was behind the counter. She was not humming. She was waiting. She had made the tea already. She had used the chipped cup for him and a different cup for herself, and she had set them both on the small table near the counter. The same table where they had sat the year before. There was a small jar of late wild flowers in the center of it now that Sable had picked from the side of the road on her drive in. He sat down across from her. He did not pick up the cup at first. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrapped his hand around it, the way a man wraps his hand around something he is afraid he will drop, and he took the first sip of tea from his mother's chipped cup that he had taken in 26 years. He did not cry. He had cried. Sable understood, in private, many times, in the year that had passed. He had done his crying in rooms she would never see, and had arrived at this table with the part of himself that came after the crying, the part that could finally sit at a small table and drink tea without breaking. "I would like to learn the song," he said. "I'll teach you," Sable said. She hummed the first line. He hummed it back. She hummed the second. He hummed it back. It took them an hour and a half to get through the whole song, and at the end of it, Bram could remember every note, including the third, the one he had not been able to find on the afternoon a year ago, the note that had been missing from him since he was 22 years old. When they were finished, he set the empty cup down. "I would like to ask you one more thing," he said. "And again, you are not required to answer. Ask. There is a small village in the place we both come from, Bravari. I have arranged, through a foundation that does not have my name on it, for the church there to be repaired. The roof has been failing for many years. The repair has already been funded, but the foundation has asked who the donor would like to dedicate the work to, and I have not given them an answer, because the answer is not mine to give." Sable thought about it. She thought about her mother who had taught the younger children. She thought about her father who had managed the trees. She thought about her grandmother who had walked her 3 kilometers through the snow. "To Vesna," she said, "to both of them, yours and mine, let it be for her, for both of them, for all of them." Bram nodded. He stood. He looked at her once more, and then he walked to the door, and he paused at the threshold. The way he had paused a year before, and without turning back. In a voice that was lower than it had been, he said, "Thank you for the song." And he walked out into the late October light. The retired postman by the window watched him go. He was 82 now. He had grown frailer in the year that had passed, but he still came every afternoon, and he still brought a paperback. And he still watched the bakery with the mild, scholarly interest of a man who had decided, late in life, that watching things was a form of love. He looked at Sable behind the counter. He looked at the empty cup on the table. He nodded once to himself. He picked up his paperback. He found his place. In a small house 2 hours north, a gray cat named Tisha was sleeping on the windowsill above a wooden table with 3 uneven legs. A chipped cup sat empty on the shelf beside the sink, waiting for the morning. A wooden box on the shelf beside it held 41 smooth stones that Sable had collected from the river, and she had named every one of them because she was building a museum, and the museum was the world. In the city, Bram Wojciech sat at a desk and opened a drawer that had been locked for a long time. He took out a photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he hummed, very softly, the song his mother had hummed in a kitchen long ago. He hummed it from the first note to the last, and when he reached the third, his voice did not catch, and his hand did not tremble, and the boy who had hidden behind the wood stove for so long stood up, very slowly, and walked out of the room. He did not come back. He did not need to. The promise had been released. Somewhere on Meriton Lane, the bell above the bakery door rang softly as a customer came in for the evening's last loaf of bread. Sable Korovin set down the dish towel. She placed her hands on the rim of the pastry case. She looked up, and she smiled. And somewhere in the back of the bakery, very quietly, she began to hum. Not a lullaby this time. A different song. A song her grandmother had never taught her. A song she was making up as she went along. Because the world is small, and it brings everything back to itself eventually. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it brings it back better than it took it. Not anymore. Not for her. Not today.